Thank you, everybody, for coming this evening, which I'm sure is going to be a fascinating talk. My name is Beth Fisher Yoshida. I am the Program Director of the Master of Science in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution. I have some other hats, but tonight that's what I am. I'm the Program Director and a Professor of Practice in the program, and very excited to have Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat here, and I have a prepared introduction. We are welcome, very welcome we're very honored to welcome Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, who I think you prefer being called Stu, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so I'll stop with the ambassador stuff, just Stu. We have Stu here. And there are many members of the Columbia University's NECR program community here, and those who are involved in government and business negotiations, and we can see, as Stu will tell us in his book, he's had a variety of experiences around the negotiation table. We've all been looking forward to hearing the ambassador's invaluable insights and lessons learned from his life in business, law, negotiation, and diplomacy. Before we begin, this is just the abridged version of his long and remarkable life of service. Otherwise, we would use up the whole time just on that. So, Ambassador Eizenstat has held a number of key senior positions across 3 U.S. administrations, which itself is a great accomplishment, right? He served as Chief White House Domestic Policy Advisor during the Carter administration and U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, and Undersecretary of State. During this time, the ambassador played key roles in the negotiations of the transatlantic agenda with the European Union, the development of the transatlantic business dialogue, the negotiation of agreements with the European Union regarding the Helms-Burton Act and the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, the negotiation of the Japan Port Agreement with the Japanese government, and the negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol on global warming, where he led the U.S. delegation. Ambassador Eizenstat currently heads Covington's international practice in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on resolving international trade problems and business disputes with the U.S. and foreign governments and international business transactions and regulations on behalf of U.S. companies and others around the world. He will also be discussing his book, which every time I talk to anybody on Zoom, they will attest to the fact that I keep holding it up. Right? So the flow of events is going to be, now that I've given a very brief introduction to Stu, he's going to show some slides, I guess, and give a 15-minute presentation. And then we're going to have a little bit of a discussion. And I believe there are index cards that you have. So if you have a comment or question you would like to ask afterwards, please write it down and we will have them collected, and then we'll try to get through as many as we can in the time that we have. And then I hope you stay for the reception that we're going to have afterwards. Sound like a plan? Okay.
They can pass their index cards.
Is what?
They can pass their index cards up.
You can pass your index. Are you collecting them?
Yes.
Sure, since
yes.
collecting them. Okay, thank you. So take it away.
Okay. Special thanks, Beth, for organizing and arranging this, and for your own teaching on conflict resolution. Just a couple of introductory remarks. I want to recognize my son Brian and my daughter-in-law Erin, my classmate from Harvard Law School, Henry Steinglass, and Sarah Levovey, who is the daughter of my classmate from Harvard Law School in '67. It was a good year. I wrote this book for 3 reasons. The first is that at a time of great turbulence, when we face seemingly insoluble problems, I wanted to demonstrate how over the past 50 years we have reached, through diplomacy, agreements on equally difficult issues and therefore can do it again. Second, because we are in the midst of hot wars in Gaza and in Ukraine, and during our lifetimes we've had multiple wars in which the U.S. has been involved directly or indirectly, from Vietnam to the 2 Balkan wars in Bosnia and Kosovo, the 2 Iraq wars under Presidents Bush I and II, Afghanistan, our longest war, and in Libya, which President Obama called his biggest mistake. And so I wanted to take a hard look at when, whether, and how military force can be used as a supplement to and to help diplomatic resolutions. And third, I fear that we're in an era of growing isolationism, which you could see from the difficulty of just getting money to Ukraine. It took 6 months for the Congress to act. And it's not unlike that era between World War I and World War II. And so I wanted the book to demonstrate how engagement by the United States has made this a better world, and how not engaging and retreating to our two oceans will create a vacuum into which Russia and China and Iran and others with very different interests and values will fill, and making the world much more difficult for your generation and for future generations. Now, the art of negotiation, and it is an art, is a bit like a painter painting on an easel. The goal is to make the other country, the other side, feel that it's in their national interest to agree to something that's in the American national interest. And there is an art to doing that. It is not a win-only situation like a poker game, where one side wins and the other side loses. It has to be a win-win situation, because the other country has got to be able to take an agreement back to their government, to their public, and get it accepted. The starting point for a successful negotiation is the president appointing the right person at the right time for the right issue. Examples: you wouldn't have had the opening to China without Henry Kissinger, or the Good Friday Agreement on Northern Ireland without George Mitchell, or Camp David without Jimmy Carter, or the solution to the Balkan War in Bosnia without Dick Holbrooke at Dayton. Having said that, it's really important to focus, and we'll do this more in the question period, on the fact that it is necessary to have the right person, but sometimes not sufficient, because it requires the two sides, or sometimes multiple parties, to ultimately have enough desire to reach an agreement, either because the mutual harm is so great that you want to change the status quo, or the mutual benefit is so great that it's worth doing. There are common skills that I found in the 130 people that I interviewed who were the key negotiators and key generals. And those common skills are essential to good negotiations. The first is a critically important skill, and that is fierce determination to grab a historical moment when it comes and see it to its end. The example that I would give, and there are many in the book, is George H.W. Bush, Bush 1, when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. Now, no one expected it. I can assure you, no one expected the wall to fall. He recognized that this was a historic opportunity to unite the two Germanys, East and West, and critically, to do it within NATO. This was a huge, heavy lift, because our wartime allies occupying Germany at the time, the Soviet Union on the east, the French and the British on the west, greatly distrusted the notion of having a reunited Germany, which had caused already 2 world wars. Margaret Thatcher, who was then the Prime Minister of the UK, said, "I love Germany so much I want 2 of them." A second attribute is courage, not the courage of a soldier on the battlefield, but the courage to depart from established positions, to break from your own political base, to take risks for peace. Sadat going to Jerusalem, he lost his foreign minister the minute he stepped foot in Jerusalem, and a second foreign minister at Camp David. The Crown Prince of the UAE, in normalizing relations in 2020 with Israel, none of those were popular with their publics. And critically, in Northern Ireland, what the British and Great British understatement called the Troubles, well, the Troubles were a vicious civil war which took the lives of over 3,500 people and maimed tens of thousands of others between the Catholics and the Protestants, the Unionists and the Nationalists. And they finally decided enough was enough. We're going to make peace, even though our publics may not be willing to follow. We've got to end this conflict. And 2 of them won Nobel Prizes for doing so. Third is a high degree of intelligence combined with wisdom and judgment of people. Zhou Enlai of China and Henry Kissinger in the opening to China certainly validated that. Next is preparation. Bob Lighthizer, who was the trade representative for President Trump, called it preparation, preparation, and preparation. Knowing your issues so well on your side and on the others that you can find the areas to compromise. There is no substitute for preparation. Example, Camp David, we're in the 13th and last day. Jimmy Carter has drafted 22 peace agreements and shuttled between Sadat and Begin's cabin. And we get to the last day and Begin comes to Carter's cabin and says, Mr. President, I cannot and will not make any more compromises. I want you to get a limousine to take me to Andrews Air Force Base. I've got an El Al plane waiting to take me home. Carter, realizing that this would forfeit all the courage that Sadat had shown, and he might even be assassinated coming back empty-handed, and that it would be a blot on his own record as president, through his preparation by reading the CIA profiles of Sadat and Begin, knew that Begin had a great love for his 8 grandchildren. And he got his personal secretary, Susan Cloud, to get their names and autographed 8 photographs, 1 to each, of the 3 leaders when they first came to Camp David, with wishes for peace. Jimmy Carter handed it to Begin at his cabin and saw Begin vocalize the names of each of those 8 grandchildren. His eyes began to tear, his lips quivered, and he put his suitcase down and said, Mr. President, for my grandchildren, I'll make one last try. Next is the ability to listen, to hear the other side, to understand where they're coming from. Is it just reading talking points, or is this really going to be their bottom line? And that means putting yourself in their shoes, looking at the world from their perspective. Because if you don't understand that, you're not going to be able to reach an agreement. Again, some examples. This was Larry Summers, who was the Secretary of the Treasury when I was his deputy, called it in the interview I did of him, unsympathetic empathy for the other side. So let's take ourselves back to the Middle East in 1973, the Yom Kippur War. Israel is really on its heels. It's been totally surprised. Golda Meir, the prime minister, is in serious political problems for not anticipating it. They counterattack with U.S. support from F-15s and tanks, and they drive the Egyptian army back into the Egyptian Sinai. And they've got the cream of that army, the Third Army, totally surrounded. And this is a chance for Golda to really recoup politically and militarily. And Kissinger, standing in Sadat's shoes, says to her, Golda, if you do eliminate that army, it will be a Pyrrhic victory, because you will have humiliated Sadat so much he'll never make peace with you. You've got to give him something to take back to Cairo. And she relented, and that's one of the reasons the disengagement agreements worked for Kissinger and ultimately Camp David for Carter. Next is creativity. I call this, again, the art of diplomacy, and there is a creative force in diplomacy because you're going to always hit an impasse, a barrier, a stone wall, and you've got to figure out how to get around it. Sometimes it's by use of ambiguous language, which has its pluses and minuses. The 1967 UN Resolution 242 called on Israel to withdraw from territories acquired in the war. It didn't define which territories. The Shanghai communique with Kissinger on China talked about the fact there was one China, Well, it didn't define which one it was, and Taiwan thought they were the one China, and the mainland thought they were the one. So ambiguous language is often essential. But an example of creativity came at a critical point in the Good Friday Agreement with George Mitchell. So the question was, how can we negotiate when the two militias are still killing each other? But neither was willing to disarm because they so distrusted each other. So he came up with what became known as the Mitchell Principles, which meant that they could keep their arms, but they had to sign a paper saying that they were going to try to resolve this by peaceful means. And that was a creative way of getting around the problem. Next, having gone through, and I was hooked on the Olympics, is stamina. Because international negotiations are like a marathon with a sprint at the end. They last not days or weeks or months, but years. And they always seem to end at 3 o'clock in the morning on the last day. So you've got to have the stamina in order to think clearly with very little sleep. Jimmy Carter got an average of 2 or 3 hours sleep for 13 days at Camp David. The whole term shuttle diplomacy came when Henry Kissinger, for 2 weeks with virtually no sleep, went between Egypt and Syria and Israel in 1973. And when I led the Kyoto negotiations on climate change, we averaged about 3 or 4 hours of sleep during that entire period. Next, to now change to another sports analogy with the Yankees in the playoff, and that is, don't swing for home runs in your negotiation, because you'll often strike out. Go for limited agreements, singles, that you can build on. If you try to get too much, you'll get nothing. When Carter started the Middle East negotiations, he wanted to get the Geneva Conference back with 22 Arab countries and Israel to solve everything. It collapsed. It was too much. So he ended up with a bilateral agreement with Egypt. But that was a terrific agreement. It's lasted now for over 40 years. Another example, again, is to go back to the Good Friday Agreement. There were two big issues in the Northern Ireland negotiations, Beth. One was, what's the status of Northern Ireland? I mean, after all, that's what the fighting was about. Is it going to be part of the Irish Republic and the South, or part of Great Britain? That was to be decided by a referendum. That's never been held. There's never been a referendum because the two sides now have enough stake in the positive status quo not to risk the referendum. And the second issue was, again, what do we do with the guns? Now we've got this agreement, the Good Friday Agreement. Won't you disarm? Well, they still distrusted each other so much. It took 9 years after Good Friday for Tony Blair to finally get them to disarm. Next, don't abandon your predecessor's agreements. There is a temptation when you win a presidential election to think that whatever your predecessor did, particularly if you've defeated him, can't be good. So I'll give you the two polar opposites. Ronald Reagan smashed us in the 1980 election. And one of the things he ran on was that the SALT II nuclear agreement that we had negotiated with the Soviets gave too much away to the Soviets and we got too little. And yet, when he came into office, although it was never ratified, he followed it to the T because he realized that it was a firm commitment by his predecessor. And he then built on it with the START agreements with even deeper cuts. The polar opposite occurred with Donald Trump. He inherits the JCPOA comprehensive nuclear agreement with Iran, and I can give you all the flaws. I've studied it very deeply, headed a task force for the Atlantic Council on it, but it was a good agreement. Instead, he withdraws in 2018, says he's going to apply maximum pressure, and now instead of having their enriched uranium capped at 2.5%, they're at 60%. They're within 2 or 3 weeks of a breakthrough in terms of military grade. Instead of having 2/3 of the centrifuges ended, they have a whole new generation of centrifuges, and so forth. So when you abandon what your predecessors done, there are real problems. And that's certainly the case with climate change. Bush 1, Bush 2, and Trump basically stay away from climate change. The Democrats, Clinton, Obama, Biden, are into it. Well, how can we negotiate and tell the Chinese and the Indians you need to do more to reduce your emissions when we are so inconsistent ourselves? And last is the ability to use leverage. Now, we all use leverage, whether we realize it or not, every day, with our spouses, our partners, our colleagues, our business associates. The use of leverage is critical, and there are two types of leverage in international negotiations. There is negative and positive leverage. Positive leverage comes from using the great resources of the United States to open our market for goods, for a product, or what pushed the UAE over the top to normalize relations with Israel was giving them F-35 fighter jets. The negative leverage comes from three things. One, economic sanctions, and we have more economic sanctions on more countries than all the other countries in the world combined. We have sanctions now on Russia for Ukraine. We have sanctions on Iran. We have sanctions on China. We have sanctions on Maduro in Venezuela. And they're all still there. Economic sanctions aren't what they used to be. We don't control things the way we used to be. And they're too easy to cheat on. So the Russians have an elaborate system of fake companies and false shipping documents to acquire products which are banned for them to get directly. It's simply too easy in this world. I'm not saying you shouldn't use them. There are some benefit, but they're not what they used to be. Second is the threat of force rather than its actual use. So, for example, in Haiti in 1994, President Clinton sends President Carter and Colin Powell and Sam Nunn down to negotiate with the dictator who had deposed a elected prime minister. And they were getting nowhere until Clinton sent the Air Force over Haiti, and he realized we were serious. More recently and today, at least until the last week with Iran, the use of additional aircraft carriers and submarines in the Mediterranean provides some buffer against Iran going too far militarily. And last is actual use of military force. And I can tell you, I've actually served in 6 administrations, but I can tell you that there is no more difficult decision a president has to make than using military force, putting in harm's way young men and young women. It's a terrible dilemma. And so there are rules and lessons. First, only use military force where you've exhausted every other means to achieve your goal. Second, make it an achievable military goal. Third, before the first bullet is fired, know what the outcome is you're seeking and that it's a reasonable outcome politically. So Steve Hadley, who was the National Security Advisor to Bush II, and Condoleezza Rice, as Secretary of State, told me that the big mistake they made in Iraq was going into and deposing Saddam before they knew what the political outcome was they were going to try to achieve. And they end up deposing someone who's a Sunni, a minority sect, in a Shiite country. This causes a huge civil war. Next is, as General Petraeus told me, you need to have a nuanced understanding of the country before you invade. And we did not in either Afghanistan or in Iraq. Next, recognize the barriers to success. There are always going to be costs and unexpected things. Former heavyweight champion Mike Tyson famously said, "Everybody's got a great plan going into the ring until somebody hits me in the nose." And there are always mistakes. So, for example, in Kosovo, NATO bombed for 77 days to try to get Milosevic, the Serb leader, to the bargaining table. Well, on one of those days, we bombed accidentally the Chinese embassy in Belgrade and killed a number of Chinese emissaries, and to this day they think we did it on purpose. Next, if you're going to use force, it should be what Colin Powell called decisive force. Bush 1 did it right. A UN resolution authorizing force, a NATO resolution authorizing force, a 38-country coalition, 500,000 troops to get Saddam out of Kuwait and back into Iraq. His son failed to recognize any of those lessons in the Second Iraq War. So what happens? No UN resolution, no NATO resolution, no big coalition, and his own Secretary of Defense says, and I'm quoting, "We're going to invade with a light footprint, not decisive force, a light footprint. And we divide our forces between Afghanistan and Iraq. Neither was decisive." And the last is good intelligence. Before you go into battle, you've got to have good intelligence. The Iraq War, of course, is a perfect example of awful intelligence, because we went into that war for the premise that there were weapons of mass destruction. Now, the irony that I found in my research is there were weapons of mass destruction. There weren't any by the time we invaded, but Saddam had actually destroyed them all in compliance with UN resolutions, but never wanted to admit it publicly because he feared it would enhance his domestic opponents and encourage Iran to invade. I was party to one of the worst intelligence failures in American history, and that is during the Carter administration. So the Shah of Iran was our guy in the Middle East. 6 presidents gave him an open shopping list for any arms he wanted. 6 weeks before he is forcibly deposed and leaves the country, 6 weeks before, the CIA reports to President Carter, I've got the document, that Iran is in neither a revolutionary nor pre-revolutionary state. Now, how can a president make a sound decision with that kind of misinformation? 6 weeks later, he's gone. And the CIA didn't realize that the Shah had incurable cancer and was not making the kinds of forceful decisions he would normally make. So these are lessons. We can talk about them in terms of Gaza and Iraq or other things. But let me just close by saying that one thing that Tony Blinken said in his interview really rings true, and that is, for diplomacy to be successful, you have to have a strong and united United States. We have to be strong militarily, we have to be strong politically, we have to be strong economically, or we don't have the force to carry out adequate negotiations. But properly used, diplomacy is a tremendously positive force to avoid the worst instincts of people, which is to shoot before you think. Thank you, and I'll be glad to take your questions now.
Okay, have a seat and refresh yourself. A lot of talking. So thank you so much for that. I just want to pick up on 1 or 2 points as you are passing your questions forward that we're going to entertain. You talk, these are like negotiation principles in general, which I think a lot of people might appreciate hearing more about. You talk about timing and ripeness in the book. That's one of my things. I love the whole idea about ripeness. You said the right person at the right time with the right issue. So if you have some of those ingredients, but not all, but there are other kinds of constraints that really are pushing you towards trying to get something done, what are some things you've done in your experience or you've witnessed that stimulates ripeness to happen faster?
So, I mean, I think ripeness occurs, that is, it's ripe for negotiation, when you have one of 2 things. The first is what one of the people I interviewed, Jonathan Powell, who was a top aide of Tony Blair, called mutual harm. And that's an example with Northern Ireland. The mutual harm for both communities had just gotten so intense. Now, you would think that in the Middle East there would be such mutual harm. I mean, with the terrible devastation that's occurring. But and I think if it were up to the publics, they might be willing to do something. But the leaders have very different views in hard and fast food. So that is not always going to be the case, even when there's mutual harm. Mutual benefit is another reason for ripeness. And, for example, why did Sadat go to Jerusalem? I mean, what would have caused him to open that diplomatic front? And it was that he wanted to get the Egyptian Sinai back with its oil fields. I mean, if you look at the map of Egypt, I mean, the Sinai is a huge percentage of the whole country, and Israel was occupying it. So the mutual benefit of doing so was incredible. Now, let's look at the UAE normalization with Israel. Why did they do it? They did it because they realized that their oil was running out, that they needed to make the UAE a technological country, and that Israel was the best vehicle for doing that. Now, I've gone to the UAE twice, and their complaint about the Abraham Accords with Israel is very interesting. It's that there are not enough Israeli companies coming to the UAE to transfer technology. So mutual benefit, again, is a powerful driver for this. Now, if I can go to, in terms of looking at Gaza, I think that Hamas has to be defeated as a military and governing force. No country can accept another government on its border committed to its destruction. However, this can't be achieved only by military means. You have to have diplomacy as well. And let's take a look at what the diplomatic outcome could be in terms of mutual benefit, in terms of rightness. So, to my mind, there will come a point, whether it's a month, 2 months, I mean, the Israeli military already feels that they have disabled Hamas as a military force, not as a guerrilla force, but as a command and control force. But Israel's real security, in my mind, will come from the following. That is, being part of a U.S.-led, moderate Sunni coalition, with countries, by the way, most of whom they already have peace agreements with Jordan, with Egypt, with Bahrain, with Morocco, with the UAE, and soon it will come with Saudi Arabia, against the Iran axis of resistance. But the condition of that for the Arab countries is some solution to the Palestinian issue, which this government in Israel is not prepared to do. And frankly, right now the Israeli public is not prepared to do. There's such a shock from October 7th. But that is their real security. And so there has to come a time, I hope, when they see it ripe, and maybe the enticement of having the Saudis normalize relations will be sufficient. And then again, you don't shoot for a home run. You can't have a Palestinian state overnight. People have got to prove their bona fides. They have to. Let me give you an example, because it's so riveting to me. July of 2000. That's not so long ago, right? July of 2000, I'm Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, and one of the things I was responsible for was the economic dimension of the peace process. We had gotten unemployment down to 8% in the West Bank and 14% in Gaza, and I went to Gaza in July of 2000. And what I saw was beautiful. We had gotten Congress to pass a law, which still is on the books, called the Qualifying Industrial Zone. And any country that had peace with Israel, like Egypt, like Jordan, like the Palestinian Authority, if a company in this industrial zone had as little as 10% Israeli content, they could ship back to the United States with no tariffs or duties. Okay? Okay, so what did I see? I saw 30 plants, not one Israeli plant. These were plants from Singapore, from Japan, from Europe, from the US, using a small amount of Israeli content and incorporated into Palestinian-made products. And I saw in one warehouse that I went into, the products being loaded onto a flatbed truck, go through the Eretz crossing, which you see in the news today, to the airport that we got the Corps of Engineers to build for Gaza, and they were putting the foundations in for a second phase of that industrial plant. That was July of 2000. I go to see Arafat in Ramallah to tell him how excited we are about this and how much we're going to continue to support it. And he says, Mr. Secretary, before you start, I want you to tell President Clinton something for me. And I said, what is it? He says, tell him not to invite me to Camp David for Camp David 2. And I said, Mr. President, why shouldn't he? He said, it's not right. I'm not ready for the compromises he wants. He was invited anyway. Camp David was a huge failure. The Second Intifada occurred, and the rest is history. Now, one thing I wish I could show to your students who are demonstrating is that in 1947, you had two-state solution by the UN. The Arab nations didn't accept it and went to war. In Camp David, we had no Palestinians. We desperately wanted Palestinians, but the PLO wouldn't accept UN Resolution 242, Land for Peace. No Palestinians. Camp David 2, the one I'm just discussing, 2000, with Barack as Prime Minister and Arafat and Clinton. What's called the Clinton parameters. 95% of the West Bank goes to the Palestinians for a state. East Jerusalem as a capital, rejected. Go to 2005. Sharon, a very hardline prime minister, decides it's not in Israel's interest to be in Gaza. He pulls every single Israeli soldier out, and then as they're leaving, gets 7,000 settlers forcibly removed. I wish we could show the video of these settlers kicking and screaming, being loaded onto buses to get out. Forcibly removed. Not one Israeli was left in Gaza in 2005. 2006 was the Hamas election. 2007, Israel got rockets instead of roses. 2009, Prime Minister Olmert with Abbas, Prime Minister, President of the Palestinian Authority, who's now in his 16th year of a 4-year term. That's another story. He offers 96% of the West Bank and East Jerusalem as a capital, and 50,000 Palestinians coming back to Israel. And still, they don't consider it right for a resolution.
I have one more question here, and then you talk about not to drop the ball on implementation once agreements are made. And I know very often in a business negotiation also, when I work with companies, a lot of times people spend a lot of time during the process of the negotiation, lots of information is shared. Why do people drop the ball when it comes to
Okay, so that's a really good point. So let me start by saying, one of the things that distinguishes a business negotiation, a corporate deal, from an international negotiated agreement, is that a corporate deal is enforceable by law. You can go to court, or maybe the contract calls for an arbitration, but there's a remedy. Now you can appeal it for years, but okay, there is a remedy if there's a breach. For international negotiations, there really isn't anything except the mutual trust of the countries who have entered into the agreement. Now, the implementation becomes critical. We have a tendency, in the United States in particular, to feel that our job is done once we have an agreement. And we'll leave it to the parties to do the rest. Well, a good example of the problems of that is in Bosnia right now. We did not take care to implement it, to have markers to look at whether the the sort of three-headed monster we created for a government would work. We just left it. And as a result, the Serb part keeps threatening to totally pull out of Bosnia-Herzegovina. It is just a natural tendency to go on to the next negotiation and not really worry about implementing. Somehow it'll mutually be implemented. Now, there are exceptions to that. And ironically, it's the JCPOA in 2015, the Iran nuclear agreement. That had 6-month reviews built in by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And those are really thorough, honest reviews. They have 24/7 cameras at all the nuclear facilities. They get documents. And even the Trump administration, although they pulled out, admitted that there was never a violation by Iran of that agreement. So that built-in checks. The arms control agreements we have built-in checks as well. So we have precedents for doing that, and we need to do it more.
Yeah, good point. Okay, we have some questions here from our audience. You alluded to this before about intelligence failures. How do diplomats and the State Department overcome intelligence failures in the midst of crises and high-risk negotiations? So when you mentioned one before, I'm not sure if you found that it was an intelligence failure during, just before, or after. So how do they deal with it in the middle of it?
Well, one thing is to get a new head of the CIA.
At once.
But it means that you have to really scramble. You have to try to get back together. I mean, one of the reasons that we now have a NDI, that is a director of national intelligence, is to coordinate. We've got 15 different intelligence agencies. The State Department, the Defense Department, the NSA, we have all sorts of, and there was no coordination of information. So one thing we have done is to try to better coordinate our intelligence. Second, intelligence is only as good as the people who are doing it and the sources that they have. Now let's take the fabled Mossad, okay? Their intelligence in Iran is so good that they could, and I'm not saying it was a wise thing to do, by the way, they could assassinate Haniyeh, the international head of Hamas while he was visiting in Tehran. They take out their nuclear scientists. They have amazing intelligence capabilities, what they did in Lebanon in hooking up the pagers and the cell phones with explosives. But Dennis Ross, who was doing the political negotiations while I was doing the economic negotiations, and I had co-chair a think tank in Jerusalem. And we've had briefings by several generals who have told us the following, that we had terrible intelligence right next door in Gaza. We did not realize, they said, I'm quoting them, that Hamas had transformed itself from being a terrorist group that would occasionally send rockets, but nothing serious, that would send one or two terrorists into Israel to do some harm, but nothing existential, that they had transformed themselves into a full-blown terrorist army. That's the term they used. 30 to 40,000 men under arms, with sophisticated arms, organized by battalions. And yes, they said, we knew that there were tunnels because we knew of the Egyptian tunnels. We did not know, and there'll be an inquiry on this for sure, in fact, the head of the Mossad has resigned, that there were 315 miles of tunnels. I mean, we're talking about more than the New York City subway. And tunnels as deep, talking some are 25 stories. And there was just a piece in the paper a couple of days ago that said that contrary to the thinking that all of this came from Iran, 80% of the rockets and missiles used by Hamas were homemade in these tunnels. They were able to get the parts, they were able to take some of the humanitarian products that came in, pipes and things that were supposed to be used for sanitation, and they converted them into bombs. So when you have that kind of intelligence failure, you have a catastrophe on your hands, a real catastrophe. Now, ironically, young female Mossad analysts had the virtual battle plan used by Hamas. Everything down to the gliders and everything. And as it made its way up the ranks, the Mossad people said, this ragtag group of Hamas can never pull this kind of sophisticated thing off.
Well, they were surprised, right? Unfortunately. One more. How best do you create and cultivate relationships with leaders and societies that are diametrically opposed to your core beliefs and values?
Okay, so one of the things I omitted that I should have said as a skill is developing personal relationships with your negotiating partner, however difficult they may be. This is essential. So, an example, in the German reunification talks, Jim Baker, who wrote the preface for my book, and Kissinger wrote the foreword, Jim Baker took Edward Shevardnadze, who was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, away from Moscow, away from Washington, away from the press, to Jackson Hole for his retreat. And for 2.5 days, they bonded and developed a personal relationship. And he was able to convince Shevardnadze that having a united Germany in NATO was better than having a united Germany in neither camp, as sort of flotsam and jetsam. That personal relationship was tremendously important. The personal relationship that Carter had with Sadat was absolutely critical. Sadat basically said to him at Camp David, you know what I need, I'll leave it to you to get it. That personal relationship did not exist at Camp David II between Barack and Arafat. They were like oil and water. And Clinton was not able to establish a personal relationship with Arafat. So personal relationships are hugely important. And even with Iran, when John Kerry was negotiating the JCPOA, there were numerous times when it looked like the negotiations were going to blow up, and he ended up going to Zarif's hotel room, and over drinks they were able to iron things out with nobody else there. I mean, one of the reasons that Camp David was chosen for the negotiations between Egypt and Israel was because it was a retreat. No press was allowed. Mm-hmm. And that enabled, Carter went to a Shabbat dinner that the Israeli delegation had. He took them both to Gettysburg to see the battlefield, to show them what future wars would be, result in with more deaths. So, I mean, these kinds of personal touches are hugely important.
Which must be very challenging to do when you really don't like the other person.
They're very challenging to do, but you have to do it. I mean, I did it in my Swiss and German and Austrian negotiations with Chancellor Schussel of Austria. I negotiated a property and slave labor agreement. And he had included in his new coalition the Freedom Party, which, by the way, just got the most votes in the election last week, which was headed by a neo-Nazi, so much so that we actually would not diplomatically meet with the Austrians. I had to get an exemption for this negotiation. And Schussel and I ended up bonding. We had what we called the pizza negotiations because at like 1 o'clock in the morning, we were both starved, and he knew of a pizza place in Vienna that would be open. And, just breaking pizza together helped establish bonds. So yes, you have to like all sorts of people, or at least get along with them.
At least get along and eat pizza, yeah. So what are the benefits of cooperation for smaller state diplomacy? How can small states defend their interests in a multipolar and big state governed world?
Well, that's a good question, and I'll give you two examples. When I talk about leverage, we had much greater leverage militarily over the Viet Cong and North Vietnam. We had huge forces with the most sophisticated arm. The same is true against the Taliban and Afghanistan. There's a famous Afghan proverb: you have the watches, we have the time. We're going to just wait you out. We know you're not going to stay here forever, but we are. So sometimes weaker states have more leverage than you think. And if they're determined, they can do it. Now, in non-military situations, it's really very difficult for small states to have much leverage on larger states because they need those larger states for market access. But even there are certainly many times when a smaller state, by holding fast, can get the bigger state to say, okay, let's just get this done and get it out of the way. Or by banding together. So for example, the Central American countries formed a trade zone, and when we negotiated the Central American Free Trade Agreement with the Central American countries, not just with one. And that gave them more leverage. I want to give you another example of a personal relationship. So my dear friend Bernie Aronson was the mediator in a 50-year civil war in Colombia between the FARC and the Colombian government. And the FARC was a really, really rough group. I mean, really rough. Assassinations and so forth. And Bernie developed a relationship with the FARC leadership, convincing them that under Obama, that they had a different kind of president who was willing to democratize Colombia and bring them into government. But second, by this one gesture, he really broke the ice, and that is the FARC leader developed an illness and was in the hospital right at the beginning of the negotiations. And Bernie went to see him in the hospital room and didn't negotiate with him, just to see him, saying that, he really was depending on him getting better. And that really made a huge difference, that personal touch.
Yeah, good point. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time now. You have really given us so much. Let's thank you. And I recommend you read the book.
Well, I recommend that you buy it. It's outside.
Buy it and read it.